Okay, so today we're going to talk about reproducible research this week. It's a lot about communicating the models that we're developing. So I'm going to walk you through a method to do that. We're going to use something called a quarto file, which is a different type of file type inside VS Code. But I'm going to talk you through why this is important for the field generally, and then how to use a little bit of Markdown, which is another kind of programming language that's really easy to use. You probably already used it and don't even know. So let's just dive into this. I'll try and get through it pretty quick. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about reproducible research, why that's important. Then we'll talk about our markdown. Sorry about that, but there will be some references to R in this that we can kind of ignore because they totally apply to what we're doing this weekend by using Python. So I'll show you those, but just don't worry about that. And then I'm going to switch over to VS Code and show an example of how to use this. But again, the goal here at the end is to have some skills in the area of developing this, kind of high-end HTML output, all right, that we can actually publish online. So we can talk through our problem. We can see, what the analytical output is, draw conclusions, put in graphics, all sorts of stuff, and then publish that online or in an HTML file that we can share really easily. And it's super lightweight. So one example of why this is important, we're talking about transparency, and our ability to communicate our results came from Beggerly and Combs. It's this really famous talk in 2010. And they just went through the details associated with a particular study that they were looking at that they had some questions about, really associated with cancer research. So they were in the field of bioinformatics. All right. So, and it was highly influential and kind of created this entire, kind of movement around, open source materials and how important that is. All right. So they were trying to replicate, which means try to redo a study on child leukemia. All right. So a really kind of deadly form of cancer in children. All right. That had shown really good results. Right. But as it turns out, they weren't able to reproduce it. And so when they tried to, all right, they started with the raw data set and they tried to reproduce the results, and they were just unable to do that. And so the problem was that the authors of this particular study had not provided any scripts or discussion of the data how they manipulated it, or the kind of the cleaning process or choices that they made leading up to the analytical analysis. So they had the original kind of raw data and they had the results, but they really had nothing, as you can see, it's kind of obvious, nothing in between. All right. So they went back and they did some real kind of deep dive. They call this a forensic approach, where they tried to figure out this question mark. All right. And eventually they found some pretty disturbing errors. One, which is more common than you might think, is called this kind of off by one error, which means is that they were copying and pasting data into cells in a way that the left column was off. So the left was off of the column headers, and that created a one by off error where the data for a gene where it was listed in one row was actually above the gene name. So instead of getting those rows lined up, they were off by one. And then they coded the treatment as a 1 or a 2, all right, along the way, but someone confused what 1 and 2 meant. Right? So not only did they have this off by one error, right, but they also started switching essentially the treatment controls, which is a huge problem, obviously. And that meant they reported positive effects for the treatment group when it was actually not a positive effect. It was a positive effect for the control group. And if you know something about controlled studies, that means that the treatment was actually not effective. Okay, so it was showing positive events for a group that was actually not getting any treatment. All right, in other words, worse than that, right? The treatment might actually harm people. Okay. So it took a long time for them to be able to actually get to the principal investigators here, because obviously they were very worried about their reputation and grant money, being affected because of this bad work. And, it wasn't until it turns out the principal investigators had lied in other ways, they're pretending to be a Rhodes Scholar when they're not, that the information came to light and they stopped it. But they were actually treating children with this approach. And so you can imagine that is just a tragic outcome here. But luckily it was stopped. And so it became a really famous case. And so I'm not saying that we don't have high stakes like, pediatric cancer research, but we are doing some things that affect people's lives. And then it's also it kind of makes us up our game a little bit. Like if we produce the results in a way where other people can pick it up and take a look at it, and we say, hey, we don't have anything to hide because we think we did a really good job here. But if we did, let us know. All right. So there's easy ways to do this. And one of the easy ways to do it is using code in combination with Markdown. It's something we're going to work through called Corto. And we're going to use .qmd files where we can actually just write and we can embed images and we can put the code right there. Then we can publish it so everybody can take a look at it and check our work. Right? It's actually a really nice way to publish projects that you've worked on and build a portfolio. And it's a simple language, and we're going to walk through how to do that so we can get through, so we can adhere to these best practices of kind of open data science and reproducibility. And then also, I mean, it's just good for us because we can publish our projects and they can look pretty awesome. All right. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. We're going to, I'm going to stop this lecture here after we talk about just real quick, go through some of this. I'm going to show you that the Markdown language generally. Okay. So we're going to weave, and here you can just replace this R reference here in RStudio with VS Code. We're just going to weave in Markdown and Python. I'll show you how to do that. And we'll do this in this very lightweight way, all right, where we can essentially compile these two things. Markdown is just basically text or table settings. It's kind of a cheat code for HTML, all right? So it's a wrapper for HTML. And then our code will produce the code that we want. And we can weave those two things together and create a really beautiful kind of standalone document that can be published online. And I'll show you how to do that, okay? All these things are true here, these table settings, all that. So I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to switch over to VS Code, and I'll have a short video